Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Western Civilization 2. Today we're going to be going over the Second Industrial Revolution and the process of democratization. This lecture is going to cover the years 1848 to 1890. Our focus question is going to be, how did the innovations and upheavals of the Second Industrial Revolution transform societies and redefine the relationships between technology, political power, and social identity? So grab a pen and a paper, a tablet or a keyboard, and let's begin. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Industrial Revolution. That is the first Industrial Revolution. And some of the things that distinguish it from what some historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. So let's dig in. First Industrial Revolution is going to be mostly Britain. It's going to mostly revolve around mechanizing production, mechanizing certain processes, like particularly the textiles. So there's going to be a heavy textile focus. It's going to introduce the factory system. Socially, the first industrial revolution is going to displace agricultural labor. Many of them are going to move into the cities, and so there's going to be a big increase in urbanization as well. The Second Industrial Revolution is going to follow many of these same processes, but it's going to be the First Industrial Revolution on steroids. So it's going to be a lot bigger than the First Industrial Revolution was. And it's going to affect more sectors and is just basically going to be a much wider reaching phenomenon. One of the big drivers of the Second Industrial Revolution is going to be technological advances. So some of the areas that we're going to see begin to become industrialized, and some of the most significant industries are going to be steel production. The second Industrial Revolution is going to focus very much on what are sometimes called heavy industries, like steel. It's also going to see the creation of new technologies that weren't really a gigantic factor previously, like the chemical industry and the electrical industry. And it's going to, in general, lead to a very rapid acceleration of industrialization, leading to great outputs in productivity and phenomenal economic growth. It's also going to bring in its wake some very profound political change. To a lesser degree, the same could be said of the First Industrial Revolution, but the Second Industrial Revolution is really where the social structure is going to shift in a fundamental way. Like with the First Industrial Revolution, we're going to see increases with urbanization, except these will be much wider reaching, affecting more places. There's going to be a huge expansion of the proletariat as well as the middle class. And this is going to fuel all sorts of political change. It's going to fuel some of the ideologies that we've started to see develop, like liberalism, socialism, and nationalism. And it's going to just, bring massive amounts of change in its wake. We should mention, though, that the changes are not going to be uniform. So not all areas are going to be affected at the same rate. Political change is going to be very much contingent on the pace of industrialization in a particular area. So areas that industrialize more thoroughly are going to see more profound changes than places that don't industrialize as rapidly. It's also going to really depend on the political structure. So more authoritarian regimes, at least temporarily, are going to be able to put a lid on some of these changes, ultimately unsuccessfully, but at least for a while. And also culture always depends on things. Different peoples react to industrialization in different ways. All right, so what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the technologies that emerge after the second half of the 19th century, and just stop and pause for a moment to think about how profound these innovations would have been. So the Bessemer steel process was incredibly influential in this process. The Bessemer steel process essentially could make steel at a much reduced cost than previous methods. And so it gave engineers and manufacturers the ability to produce great amounts of steel. And because it was cheaper, it was going to mean that it could be used for all sorts of different processes. And unlike the earlier Industrial Revolution, which had some production in iron, and iron has all sorts of problems to it, steel is actually just a phenomenal building material. And so we're going to see Bessemer steel is going to be applied to all sorts of uses. Railroads are going to be replaced by them. So some of the older iron tracks, which were already beginning to wear out, are going to be replaced. Bridges are going to be constructed with steel. It's going to allow engineers to span spaces that they previously couldn't span. Skyscraper construction is going to really proliferate with this new, cheaper technology. It's going to allow engineers to build buildings higher and more securely, because steel will bend and has a much greater load than bricks, obviously, but and iron was just never really feasible. And then it's also going to allow for some advances in shipping as well. And so really this puts the nail in the coffin of the age of the sailing ship. Engineers are no longer going to be limited by how big a tree can grow or something to that effect. Ships are just really, the sky's the limit now. And we should think about the profound effect all of this is going to have, what it's going to do to the skyline, what it's going to do to shipping rates, what it's going to, the secondary effects are definitely worth pausing and considering for a while. As I said, the second industrial revolution was going to really bring brand new industries into existence that hadn't existed. The chemical industry is one area. It's going to bring in new applications for dyes, dyes that will just adhere to color better, keep their vibrance. It's going to impact the pharmaceutical industry. So much of the pharmaceutical industry is chemically based. Brand new industry that's created second half of the 19th century. Agricultural fertilizer, believe it or not, is heavily indebted to the chemical industry. It's going to allow for better and cheaper fertilizers that are going to enhance food production. Material sciences, things like rubber. Later on, plastics will become a byproduct of this. And so it's going to have a really big impact on people's quality of life. positive and negative. At first, the negatives weren't really seen with the chemical industry. People were focused on just how many new products this allowed them to make and to consume. Also, electrification is a brand new technology. Um, it's going to, its probably most profound application is going to be to lighting. It's going to change the look of cities. Prior to this time, cities tended to be very dark places after hours. There wasn't much in the way of lighting. It's also going to affect the way industry operates. It's going to allow for longer shifts, 24-hour production, and then a whole host of other electronic technologies. Just look around your house now and think about all of the things that you plug into the wall, all of the appliances, those all run off of electricity. I mean, really, we just can't even begin to appreciate how much electricity has changed our lives. And then, we have to think, since we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, all of the appliances that we buy that plug into electricity. And so those are all going to need to be manufactured. And so we're talking about, just with these three, and there are many more we could talk about, some very, very profound effects that come along with the Industrial Revolution. Okay. There's also some economic transformations that accompany the Second Industrial Revolution. And these are more in terms of finance and organization. And so the first one that I want to focus in on is the assembly line. This is popularized by Henry Ford, although it borrowed off of earlier developments. And essentially what this allows for is the rapid assembly of standardized parts. And so machine technology was sophisticated enough that parts could be made identically at this point, and then assembled along a line. This was going to greatly lower the production costs. All right. It was going to allow workers to rapidly manufacture products by breaking them down into smaller parts, allowing one person to do the same job repetitively over and over again, and picking up speed as a result of that. It's going to allow for the proliferation of some of those cheap consumer goods that we talked about that were going to have to be made. And it's going to really change the dynamics of labor, because you're going to be able to use very much unskilled labor, which is where previously making a product usually required quite a few people who are very skilled. It's going to break things down into small repetitive tasks. Ultimately, this is going to have some negatives, because, as you can imagine, this is going to lead to dissatisfaction among a lot of workers. These jobs tend to be boring. We're also going to see corporate growth, and the growth of the modern corporation is going to partly be made possible by technology as well. For a corporation to run effectively, it needs to be able to communicate over wide area, along long distances. This is going to be made possible by the telegraph and the telephone. Corporate headquarters can be located in one place, and you can have branches elsewhere. They'll be able to coordinate their complex activities over a large area. The existence of a transportation network, at this stage rail, is going to allow them to distribute products over a wide area. And one of the things we're going to start to see is the concentration of production into a relatively small group of firms. And so corporations tend to operate on the monopoly model. If you've ever played a game of Monopoly where one player begins to accumulate the properties, and then it becomes very difficult because they get so big and so expansive that it's only a matter of time before the other players get swallowed up. And so we're going to see this the rise of some of these monopolies or trusts, as they're sometimes called, in oil, steel, railroad. Some of these big heavy industries are going to move in this direction. Operating on larger scale is going to allow them to operate at a lower cost, and so they're going to be able to drive out competition. We're also going to see a revolution in financing. It's one thing to build a small factory by the side of a river and buy a couple of spinning jennies to crank out some yarn. It's a very different thing to build transcontinental railroads, or to lay telegraphs across the Atlantic Ocean, or to build a massive steel operation. And so these are all going to acquire vast, vast sums of money, much more than could be provided by small individual loans like the first Industrial Revolution had been financed by. And so we're going to start to see big investment banks begin to take shape. These banks are going to have sufficient amounts of capital to be able to loan and expand industry. We're going to see the rise of the stock market. These companies need to raise vast sums of money, and oftentimes that'll be by through corporate shares. And we're also going to see international finance begin to take root. For many developing countries or projects in developing countries, perhaps in colonies, these corporate financiers are going to provide the capital to developing countries or colonial enterprises, and places like London and New York are going to become the headquarters for this sort of overseas financing. Okay. So much for the Second Industrial Revolution. Of course, much, much more could be said about this. We didn't talk very much about automobiles or many of the other profound changes that occurred during this time. But I want to switch gears and talk about how the Second Industrial Revolution is going to change the political landscape of Europe, North America, and really other places as well. So one of the things that the Second Industrial Revolution is going to hypercharge is the growth of the middle class. Many of these financiers, many of these folks building these factories, many of the folks who are buying these stocks belong to the middle class. And of course, an usual caveat, when we say middle class, we're using the European designation of middle class. In America, we tend to think of the middle class as people who make below $250,000 or $400,000 or whatever your number is for what the middle class is. In Europe, when we talk the middle class, we're basically talking about people who don't work with their hands and who aren't nobles. So in Europe, the upper class has traditionally been reserved for the nobility. The middle class is that group of people who have money and skills and talent, but who don't have a noble title. Well, anyways, these people who are being supercharged, even for lower middle class, I should mention, we talk about all the people who do some of the less prestigious work, like keeping the books at places or school teachers. There's a whole host of people we could include in this middle class. But for our purposes, it's people who don't work with their hands and who aren't noble, and many of which do have money. Nonetheless, these people are growing. They're growing in power, they're growing in wealth, and one of the things that they feel is that they're denied political power. For everywhere outside of maybe Britain and France at this time in the United States, these talented, wealthy, enterprising individuals lack political authority. And they want to change voting laws so that they're allowed some sort of representation, that they're allowed parties that will cater to their particular interest. And so as they grow in power, they become a real force to be reckoned with by many of these governments, especially the ones who are resisting them and who are clinging to absolutist models. On the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum are labor unions. If the middle class is growing, the proletariat or working class is growing incredibly powerful, by great numbers. The rise of factories, and these are much, much larger factories than before, have concentrated thousands and tens of thousands of workers together. It's into factories, and also millions of workers together into urban areas in general. Many of these workers are dissatisfied with their working conditions. Many of them attempt to unionize to protect their political interests, or their working interests, I guess I should say, arguing for higher wages, better hours, safer working conditions. And the worker strike becomes a real factor. Workers are able to force their plight to public attention by stopping working. They're able to raise public awareness and public sympathy to their plight. And occasionally, they're able to, or I should say occasionally, these strikes do turn violent. And so it's a tumultuous period in that regard. Strikes in labor unions are going to have profound political impact as the public becomes aware of the plight of workers. They are able to disrupt they're able to disrupt the economic status quo. It's going to begin to lead to a more tolerant approach toward labor and some of their demands. And so many of the labor laws that had been put into place that prevented striking or forbid workers from organizing are struck down. And there's a shift in public opinion toward a recognition of workers' rights. This period of the late 19th century is a period of suffrage expansion. Just to be clear, the word suffrage means the right to vote. In those countries that did have voting of some sort, like Great Britain, initially it was only property-owning males who were afforded this right. And so in Great Britain, it was a relatively small percentage of the population, and that was the country with the greatest amount of suffrage. Britain in the early 19th century gradually expanded this to include members of the middle class or upper middle class. But it was going to be in the second half of the century, and thanks in part to the Second Industrial Revolution, that the urban population of Europe was going to become more literate, Newspapers were going to proliferate, and there was going to be a big push to expand the vote for working class men. Increasingly, their role in society could not be denied, and increasingly, they themselves were more vocal, demanding this right. And so universal male suffrage was gradually expanded. In France became the first country to institute it in 1848. It was followed by Germany in 1871, where all men got the right to vote. And in the UK, following their usual gradual approach, the franchise, or the right to vote, was greatly expanded in 1867, and then by 1884, I believe all men could vote. And in some countries, there even began voices that were beginning to call for the expansion of the franchise to women. And so the women's suffrage movement became a rallying cry, though it would have to wait until the 20th century in most places. As the franchise was extended, new political parties began to emerge. Many of these parties were class-based. And so we start to see parties that are, as the working class gets the vote and they become such a large share of the population, parties begin to cater to them. Even in Britain, the old Liberal Party, the party that was pushing for free trade and keeping the government out of business, laissez-faire, they even began to modify their liberal position and recognize the need for worker protections and at least some modest reforms. Many places also saw the rise of parties that were focused on and dominated by workers. Many of these parties argued for labor rights and for different forms of social welfare, social safety nets, and the like. For example, the Social Democratic Party in Germany became one such party, as German males were given the right to vote. Increasingly, a lot of these parties have some sort of ideological focus to them. And so some of these parties, particularly those on the left and dominated by workers, are going to be socialist and in some cases even communist. As I said, conservative and liberal parties themselves have to adapt. So the Liberal Party, or the Whig Party as it's called in the UK, began to be more worker-focused. And the other party in Great Britain, the Tories, or the Conservative Party, became really a party that stopped catering just to the nobility, but had to include even members of the middle class into it. And so you start to see a pull to the left on those parties. We also start to see the rise of parties that are nationalistly focused, particularly in areas where there were more than one ethnicity. And many times, these parties will focus on a particular nationalist agenda for either greater rights or perhaps even separation of the ethnic group that they represent. I mentioned that many of these leaders, particularly those from conservative parties, recognized the need to change the way that they marketed themselves, especially after workers gained greater rights. It was definitely a different political landscape from a time when only upper class males could vote. And so I want to focus on a couple of strategies that some conservative politicians used. During the late 19th century, one of the most important conservative candidates, leaders, I should say, was a man by the name of Benjamin Disraeli from Britain. And Disraeli recognized that workers were soon going to get the right to vote, that it was only a matter of time, Parliament was going to have to act, and that eventually you couldn't prevent lower class workers from voting, and it was just going to be a matter of time. And so, whereas it had traditionally been the Liberal Party that had argued for greater expansion of the franchise, Disraeli, in an astute political move, beat them to the punch. Right? So conservatives had traditionally been against expanding suffrage to workers. And so he actually proposed a doubling of the amount of people who could vote. All right. And so rather than let the liberals propose it and then get the credit for it, he essentially doubled the size of the electorate, hoping to win votes. He also pioneered worker legislation that was going to hire worker. And this again is from the Conservative Party, which just shows you how astute politicians would need to adapt to the changing realities, and how really industrialization changes the political makeup. Perhaps a more famous and far-reaching sort of political transformation occurred with Otto von Bismarck, whom we talked about as the person who was really behind the unification of Germany. Bismarck, as we know, was very astute diplomatically, but he also was pretty astute as a politician. Bismarck was very alarmed by the growth of socialist parties after 1871. And as a very conservative individual, he was concerned that these parties were going to undermine the political stability of Germany, which he had worked so hard to manufacture. And so, again, in an attempt to beat socialist parties to the punch and to win credit for himself and for his government, he pioneered social insurance programs. And so public health insurance. So if a worker is injured or can't work anymore, they would be covered. Well, this was actually first introduced by Otto von Bismarck in 1883. Bismarck went on to promote accident insurance in 1884. In 1889, Germany became the first country to have an old age pension. And so we can see here that in a bid to siphon off votes from growing socialist parties, even an arch conservative like Otto von Bismarck recognized the need to change and to bend. He did also simultaneously try to ban socialist parties, because even with these parties continued to grow. So we need to be clear, Bismarck definitely does not believe in social equality, but this is more of a pragmatic response to the growth of labor movements and their potential for social unrest. And these, I should mention, were going to be the foundation for future social programs around the world. The last thing that I want to talk about is the focus of nationalism. We mentioned that nationalism was a potentially, it was a powerful force, and one that many politicians began to see the utility of. And so oftentimes Conservative politicians, or politicians in general, found that by focusing on nationalism, that they could gain and maintain power. So nationalism became a tool for skillful politicians, especially in a time when there was rising class tensions. You had the proletariat and the middle class and all sorts of social antagonisms. Many politicians felt that the flag or the national anthem or the nation in general was something that people could rally around, cut across class lines. Politicians also began to find that colonial expansion was a way that they could improve their political image and to get people to rally around the nation. And as a way to try to heal some of these social and class tensions. Nationalism could also be used to focus on external threats. So perhaps rival nations. Politicians could often get budgets passed by warning their populace of the danger of their neighbor, who they were told was arming and ready to pounce on them at any time. And this may or may not have been true. It was true in some cases, but in some cases it was just used as a way to control and to maintain power. Another tool in some places was to find a minority group to get people to rally around and hate. More often than not, the preferred group was the Jews. And so we start to see the rise of political parties who include the hatred or the dislike of Jews as part of their political strategy. So in conclusion, the Second Industrial Revolution was going to see great industrial progress. Europe, and really the world, was going to be transformed. There was going to be great economic growth and prosperity, unlike the world had ever seen before. This was going to be accompanied with greater amounts of urbanization as more people streamed into cities. And this was going to really transform the way that people live and work. And we'll look at the more cultural side in our next lecture. This was also going to lead to profound political change as democratization began to take root. The period saw the expansion of the franchise or the right to vote. New political parties were going to be created, and existing political parties were going to have to adapt. The second industrialization was going to see a great change societally as well, as the middle class and the working class grew at the expense of the old nobility and even to the peasantry to some degree. These two new social groups, the middle and working class, were going to have exert profound influence on society, and this was going to be at the expense of traditional elites. Increasingly, nationalism became a unifying force, and colonialism and also the scapegoating of minority groups was going to be part of the political calculus, especially at the hands of unscrupulous politicians. And so we'll see that in the upcoming lectures as well. Okay. So what I would like you to do is grab a pen and paper and answer this question. How did the innovations and upheavals of the Second Industrial Revolution transform societies and redefine the relationship between technology, political power, and social identity?